Good morning. You're listening to WPVM LP in Asheville, North Carolina. 103.7 on the dial. This is the BLAINESWORLD Show, and we're heard each Wednesday here at 9 a.m., and you can also watch us on WPVM's Facebook page. I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, and I'm here in my Zoom studio in lovely downtown Fairview, North Carolina. Each week we focus on the Asheville theater scene, as well as on positive news and information about people and organizations in both Western North Carolina and throughout the country. And toward that end, it's my pleasure to introduce Alison Cross. Welcome aboard, Alison.
Thanks. It's lovely to be here.
Okay, and by the way, you can wave to all your fans and friends in Facebook world. So if you're watching, that is Alison Cross. Alison Cross is a licensed clinical mental health counselor in North Carolina and Georgia, and she's a working mom who specializes in helping those with eating disorders and body image issues. Alison is also a certified eating disorder specialist and loves supervising new and trained clinicians. While living in Georgia for 23 years, Allie, by the way, is that what you prefer, Allie?
Allie, Allison, whatever one is fine, but yeah.
Okay. Alison worked at all levels of mental health care with a focus on clinics, clients that have a troubled relationship with food and body. In the interest of prevention and awareness, the Body, Beauty, and Bravery Project, NEAT, was born. Today, many people have had the opportunity to listen to Alison speak on a workshop, seminar, retreat, or day camp to learn and feel at home in their bodies, and they're getting to see you on Facebook Live here. Alison and her husband and 4 daughters moved to Asheville in 2018, where she started her outpatient practice in both Hendersonville and Asheville. Since then, she's become a Level 1 internal family system therapist and about to complete Level 2 training in the embodied recovery model for eating disorders. Just before the pandemic, Alison started a local and nonprofit chapter of the International Association of Eating Disorder Professionals, where education and networking opportunities are provided to local healthcare professionals. In her spare time, I love it. She loves to hang out in your spare time, right? With her family, hike, play piano, speak French, and explore the world of woodworking. So I should begin by saying bonjour.
Well, and I should tell you, my French speaking, my piano playing, and my woodworking is terrible.
Okay. Well, but you heard I think all I remember from high school, French, bonjour, so.
Bonjour.
Okay, good.
Technically it's bonsoir. Well, no, actually bonjour. Yes.
Thank you. Well.
Yeah, I told you it was terrible.
Look, I can't say mine is better. Let me ask you this, Alison. You grew up as a kid where?
Oh boy, all over. I was born in DC, and my parents moved quite often because my dad was working with the government.
And as a little kid, growing up in part in Washington, but all over, did you always know you want to be a mental health counselor?
No, I had no clue.
As a kid, what do you want to be?
Oh gosh, as a kid, can I think back that far? I knew I just wanted to be around people. I wanted to have a smile on my face, and I wanted to be intrigued by whatever I did. That was my criteria.
Okay, good criteria. For anybody, I think, a great thing for any career or life thing that you do. So how'd you get into mental health counseling?
Well, when I arrived at college, I had to pick a major, and I thought, psychology sounds interesting. And really, that's about how it went down. And I just followed my gut instinct. But I had a really terrific psych professor at my very small college who took us on a 3-week field trip up and down California. And we got to interview all the top psychologists of the day and go to all these great grad schools and hear about their programs. And that's when I knew I needed to go get my master's in counseling.
What was that, your freshman year or?
Gosh, no, 1993, so I was a junior in college.
Here's the question. The professor, are you still in touch with that professor?
I'm not. He's retired.
Okay, can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
I tell people to do this because I think I told you off the air, I've been a college professor. And one of the things I love is people keep being in touch with me or me being in touch with them. So your assignment, if you so choose to accept it, is, do you remember the person's name?
Yeah, Dr. Rulon, Mike Rulon at Covenant College.
Okay, so we'll mention him, give a shout out to him. Can you, do you have his email address or could you track him down?
I could probably track him down through the college, yeah.
So if you're listening, Dr. Rulon, or we want you to, or through the college, send them a copy of the tape because we just wanted to let you know it's a great story you told that all these years later, you made an impact on somebody's life. So,
oh, he really did, yeah.
Okay, but will you do that? the
I will. I accept your challenge.
Okay, but it's just so cool, and let me know what happens. But anyway, so that's really what a great experience as a junior. So that just cemented you. So all these programs, and you knew that's what you wanted to study for your master's.
Oh, absolutely. I just had lots of clarity around that.
Very
Yeah.
cool. And it's funny because that's what you hope for all children to do when they go in college or anywhere. You know that they come up with what they want to do, and so you're
Mhm.
lucky as opposed to having gone through 4 years and not knowing that. So you then went for your master's. Where did you get your master's?
I got my master's at Georgia State University and Richmond Graduate University. They had a dual program. That's in Atlanta.
Okay,
So I was
what
there
was the dual
for,
program?
well, it was also a Christian counseling program. So I got the best of both worlds in both universities. So it was a lot of learning, stuck right there in the middle of the Atlanta Olympics in 1996. And yeah, there's a lot that I don't remember because so much was crammed in a small amount of time.
So what
But
got you into eating disorders?
I, again, following a gut feeling and looking back on it, I know I was trying to put my own story together because, if you don't have anorexia, if you don't have bulimia, then you don't have an eating disorder, which is a huge myth. There's a lot of disordered eating out there that can be just as damaging as a full-blown eating disorder. And so that's what I had. And I just really wanted to just find my own path and my own journey and my own healing through that, which is what really draws a lot of folks to getting a master's is
Well,
their own healing.
well, if I can kind of put you on the spot, and hopefully I don't make you feel uncomfortable, but you mentioned you had an eating disorder as well?
Well, I had some disordered eating and body image issues that lasted a really long time, even throughout becoming a mother and even throughout getting my career started and working at all levels of eating disorder therapy, like in the hospital or outpatient or whatever. But I never felt like it was clinical or a huge issue. But just later through life experience and different mentors, I recognize this is an issue and I don't want to live my life this way. So it
And so
really
you
helped me.
studied it, and it helped you get past whatever was holding you back, I guess?
Oh, yeah. And I think being honest about that journey and being upfront about the parts of me that wanted to change my body and kind of felt eating disorder-ish, I think it's really powerful and hopefully reaches other professionals because I know there are other folks that are licensed, they are therapists and healthcare professionals, and they have parts of them that struggle with this issue as well. So hopefully, I'm normalizing that and creating a safe place for conversation and learning.
Talk to me about the fact that we're talking about eating disorders. Maybe
Mhm.
it's unfair that it's gotten the rap, but still mostly women. But there are guys who have eating disorders also?
That's a myth.
Yeah, right, exactly.
It affects everyone, absolutely everyone. I think when we heard about eating disorders, like what's the first thing that pops in your mind as far as celebrities go?
Right.
Karen
Right.
Carpenter. Yeah. So, and we think of rich white women
Right, for the most
or
part, yeah.
young women. Yeah. But really, those are the people that had access to healthcare. And that's why they were coming through hospitals and catching the attention of doctors and therapists and things like that. It seemed like a white woman's disease, but really it affects absolutely everyone. And we know that now because of the research that's out there.
What's very tough, I imagine, for mothers, but also for dads as well, is
Yeah.
how do you work with a child and not having become, with an eating disorder? For example, my wife and I watched the show This Is Us. Do you watch that at all?
Oh, I love that show.
Okay.
Yes,
Well,
except they've screwed up some of the writing around this.
but because you're talking and it's getting me to think about the part. I remember
Yeah.
that the wife and the husband battle over this. How do you treat the kid? How do you work with the
Yeah.
kids so that they don't get messed up? And so tell
Yes.
me, that's interesting. How do they screw up the writing on this, in your
Now
opinion?
that the you could tell how the mom was so uncomfortable around her daughter
Right.
gaining some weight, and even a little bit around Kevin, the son who was kind of scrawny, and his dad wanted him to bulk up. And so there was definitely messages there. And I think that that part of the writing was beautifully
Right.
accurate.
Right.
And I think that parents do hold that energy, the insecurity, the deep concern and love that they have for their children. They want them to belong and to be okay. So they're passing on what they think is healthy and okay.
But I
Yeah.
found equally interesting in the series, though, was when Kate then is older and she has children and she's battling with her husband. How do you feed children without having them get issues? I thought that part was fascinating.
Well, chances are, because both Kate and
Right.
Toby have an eating disorder, that their kids are probably going to struggle with that too. And so keeping it as part of the conversation, I think, is really healthy. But this is where my issues and my red flags go down, is that Kate was always the one seen as the problem, right? Because she's in a larger body. And yet that's her only sin, so to speak, is that she was born and meant to be in a larger body. She is one of those folks that are probably at the other end of the continuum, right? Of what's normal. And you have very fat people, and then you have very thin people. I'm not saying fat in a negative way, because I'm not practicing fat phobia. But Toby had a lot of obsession with food and body, and he had a lot of restriction going on in his life. That was not a part of the writing. And but you saw it play out at the meal when he's
Right.
picking apart what his young children are eating. And Kate's like, what's going on? What is this? And she
Well,
challenged it, and I love how she did that.
me too. I was so moved by it. But you're raising a good point, Allison, in terms of as parents or adults, how do we make sure our children don't have eating disorders? And then I'll make it a two-part question because again I don't
Yeah.
know the answer. You can guide me in it. So how do we prevent our children from having eating disorders? Perhaps even more significantly, when a child does have an eating disorder, how does somebody know if a child has an eating disorder or an adult has an eating disorder? What are the signs?
Well, I think you're going to have a lot of obsession with body image, with what foods you're going to be putting in your mouth. There's a lot of diet culture influence, and knowing what diet culture is can be very helpful. If you're listening to this and you're a research type, I highly recommend listening to the book, or actually reading it, holding it in your hands and reading it. The Origins of Fat Phobia, Fearing the Black Body by Sabrina Strings, because it really goes into where does all this information come from, and emphasis on thinness, because the big fallacy that's out there is being thin does not equal good health. And that's really what diet culture is based on, this myth. And we have a lot of people that do try to lose weight. They feel like it gives them a higher status, higher moral standing. And yet 98% of the people that lose weight gain it right back.
Right.
And they
Yeah.
end up damaging their metabolism. And that's also gateway behaviors to developing an eating disorder.
But talking about then a child who has an eating disorder, as you're pointing out, it can be adults as well. And by the way, is there a typical time when people develop an eating disorder, or it can be at any time?
It could be at any time. Like I have an office here in Asheville and one down in Hendersonville, and the culture is very different, right? But I've seen eating disorders in children as young as 7, or I even see folks down in Hendersonville that are retired that have eating disorders.
And they
And
didn't, excuse me a second, they didn't have it beforehand, they just developed as they got retired?
yes, because it's a life transition. And there might have been some food and body stuff going on throughout life, but then when retirement comes, there's no job. I had a client who was obsessed with weight loss her whole life and was off and on diets. And a part of her to-do list was, by the time she retired, was lose weight and clean out the closet. And after her retirement, those are the only 2 things that she could think about and focus on. And she's like, I don't want to play this mental game anymore, because it just got worse and more intense for her.
How
So we
about the
get to dive into what that was about.
how about the 7-year-old? How'd the 7-year-old wind up with an eating disorder?
Oh, well, first of all, it was genetic. It runs in the family.
Does it?
Um, Yes,
Okay.
it does. There is a genetic component. And also, a lot of it was coming from her own feelings about her own body. And her mom actually happened to be a plastic surgeon. And with some, that was the family business. And so, a lot of times, she was exposed to pictures of before and after, even at home. And so, as she's a 7-year old, growing and gaining and getting fat on her body, which is good and healthy and
Right.
appropriate, she's like, I need to get rid of this. This is not okay. And it was scary, honestly, as a mother, hearing a 7-year old sound like someone who's had an eating disorder for years and years.
So, as a mother then, or a father as well, so you're seeing a child, I guess, developing or some evolving thing. You see a child has a problem with the food. Aside from getting to see you, or aside from reading that book you mentioned, what can parents do on their own to prevent this kind of thinking from, growing, I guess?
Yeah, well, and I think it's when we think about using our voice, right, to affect others around us, especially as parents, we've got to deal with the voices going on inside of us first. Each parent needs to ask themselves, is there a part of me that could be projecting this nervousness, this energy that my child has to change their body in some way? That there's honestly black and white values around healthy food, unhealthy food. Am I projecting that? Could they be hearing negative messages from others? Because that's the next step is looking at the community and what messages could they be receiving. My 20-year-old daughter just told me that her third grade teacher weighed the entire classroom in her small private school. I had no idea till she told me this past week, right? But she loved and trusted her teacher,
What,
yet her teacher weighed
what was the
everybody.
purpose of weighing the children?
She wanted the children to know what their weight was and think about what they're putting into their bodies as far as healthy and unhealthy. And I also happen to know, looking back on it, that the teacher was involved with Weight Watchers at the time, which is an outside in approach to managing your food, your and body image,
We'll
and
talk a little bit about
lots of
that. So
unhelpful.
Weight Watchers, though, but for some people, it can be a good organization.
No,
Interesting. How come?
I know you want me to elaborate.
No,
I'm
no,
very
yeah, or
confused
you don't
about
have to.
that.
We won't
No,
get Weight Watchers,
well,
and we
yeah,
don't want
and
to get them upset.
Yes. I know there's lots of people out there with really great intentions. And yet, as a healthcare professional that's been doing this for over 20 years, and I've lived it, I've walked in this, and this is what's generating my activism now, is that this does harm to people when you teach them diet rules about managing their food and body. And this is what the harmful effect of diet culture, and it has origins to racism and patriarchy, and it discriminates people and oppresses people, and that's what really causes eating disorders. And that this is why we need to know more.
Well, here I can kind of guess how you're going to answer the question, but what about
Right.
the idea in terms of people watching or listening, um, keeping tabs on their weight? In other words, I'm just curious your opinion. Good or bad idea to weigh yourself, and if so, how often?
I think that's also something that's up for debate, right?
Right, that's what I'm asking.
Um, you're right, because that can also be a sign that you're not okay. If you feel like you need to weigh yourself every single day, this can become really obsessive. I know often the doctors want to weigh you, but sometimes you don't need to be weighed at the doctor
Right.
either. That's something I work with clients.
It's funny, I just read that recently. I think in the Wall Street Journal, they're talking about people having the right to say to a doctor, you don't have to weigh me, and not to
Right.
be weighed.
Well, because the truth is that our bodies, generally speaking, take care of us. We have a healthy set weight. We have a DNA, right? Like I was born to have brown hair, even though this is like a dye job and needs extra help. I was born to have the skin with freckles, I was born into this DNA, and that is how it was meant to be. And my body's taking care of me at every stage of life. And it's going to take care of me and keep me within 5 to 10 pounds almost always. And so I don't need to micromanage my weight.
What
Yeah.
about the issue, especially with people who have eating disorders, in terms of if they're hungry or if they're not? In other words, I guess I'm asking, how do you keep a register on this, or how do you keep control of how much to eat, or if you're hungry or not hungry? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, and see, absolutely, we're born with it. We know when we're hungry and we can stop when we're full is a very simple way to look at it. And yet, there's a lot of things that happen in life that can interrupt those signals. And so, talking with someone about it who's knowledgeable, like someone who specializes in eating disorders, even if you don't have one, or a registered dietitian who has had the specific training and can work with you from a health at every size model, they're going to be able to help you find your hunger fullness cues if you've gotten out of touch with that, because that's what diets also do. It's another way they harm our bodies, is it puts us out of touch with that. Because when you're put on a diet, you got a list of the good foods, the bad foods. You're very clear on what your behavior should be. And really, that's addictive. That's the food addiction that is so very harmful. Um, so helping people get rid of these myths is something that I do.
Well, in terms of getting rid of the myths, we talked before a little bit about that one show, This Is Us, but talk a little bit, if you would, Allison, with the whole nature of social media, or specifically like Instagram, and having affecting women, but guys as well, with body image issues.
Oh
And
my
it's probably
goodness.
not helpful, or even you read People magazine every week, you'll see somebody who's had miraculously 40 pounds weight loss. Yeah, by the way, you very rarely see people who talk about weight gain. I don't see that very often, but it's always the
Yeah,
weight loss.
yeah, exactly. Because someone's trying to make money.
Yeah, isn't it?
That's why. That's why. And there's so much shame and heartache that it's also part of my job to help people work through with the intense grief. But looking at social media really does not help your self-esteem whatsoever. But there's also just kind of a natural comparison. We always do that. And I don't think that's really new under the sun. I was really influenced by the work of Jean Kilbourne and her Killing Us Softly documentary series that she's done every decade. I think she's done now, but she takes a really close look at how, especially women, are portrayed in media, and then a little bit more so men. But of course, women have been disproportionately oppressed through media images that have been very irresponsible through the years. But it has helped to shape our culture in effective, sadly, ways about how we view ourselves and the expectations that we have of ourselves.
Do people come in and tell you that they watch, social media, or they're on Facebook, not LinkedIn so much, but Instagram, or name it, and that's how they get their image of themselves?
No, not really. I see it as a much deeper issue.
Okay.
While I'm a eating disorder specialist, that also means that I've learned from my clients through the years that it's really about depression, anxiety, trauma, relationships. It's about our human experience and our story and what's happening with us and how we process those events, because often we can't. So we go to our relationship with food and body because that's a lot more manageable. I can count calories, I can lose weight, I can come up with this plan, and never have to deal with what's really not okay and not going right in my life.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because in another life I studied hypnotism, and the problem with hypnotism for people with weight issues is you still have to eat. You know what I mean? It's like I work with people who smoke cigarettes. Don't smoke cigarettes. Get them to stop. But if you
Yeah.
eat, you still have to eat. No matter what you're doing, you have
Which
to eat
is why it's
something.
not an addiction.
Yeah,
Yeah, food is not an addiction. Yeah.
interesting. And back to your point, one other thing people say too, the one way to tell, so I've let your body control it, is also in large part you don't have to weigh yourself every day, because your clothes will tell you a little bit too. If or is
A
that a
few
good
ounces
is that a good or bad thing to do? To let your clothes
to weigh yourself.
no to tell you if
Oh.
you're above what I guess you're telling me there's no should in this, right? I guess that's a bad word to use. Should, right, is kind of throws
Shouldn't go over
people off.
yourself. Yeah.
Right. You
That's what we
should do
like to
anything or
say.
should eat. Your body will
Yeah.
tell you, not what somebody else tells you, and you have to control that yourself.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it really helps to have professional help, especially with a registered dietitian. And that's part of the work that I want to normalize, even for healthcare workers, right? That might feel a little bit uncertain about their own relationship with food and body, then I would definitely start working with an RD one-on-one, or just put yourself in a position to know more, which is what, we're doing with my nonprofit and my practice.
Interesting you say that, because that's one of the things that you were talking about doctors' offices, that every doctor is taught, first thing you get in, weigh yourself, and a lot of people don't like that, or, they don't even want to know it, don't tell it to me, or let me close my eyes. And you mentioned one other thing too, talking about the work you're doing. So now you've been involved in this nonprofit, and it segues into a show we'll have later on in the year featuring a nonprofit. But talk about nonprofit work you're doing, Alison.
Absolutely. The International Association for Eating Disorder Professionals, it's a very large organization, and coming from Atlanta, we had a very active chapter there. And that's something that I really missed when we moved to Asheville. So I started the Western North Carolina chapter, and we provide local educational events for professionals and lots of networking and support, because we need each other. And I also want to provide a safe space for folks, even doctors, because I know doctors are hearing a lot from patients, discomfort with food in their bodies, and they need to know more. And this is a safe place for them to come and to get that information as well.
Because in reality, most doctors have not been trained in this field probably at all.
Oh, I had 1 hour of training in eating disorders. 1 hour.
And you were not a medical doctor too, so.
Exactly. So that's why I'm doing the training that I'm doing with my colleagues later in September, just teaching. This is the education we should have had in grad school around eating disorders and weight stigma and nutrition.
And you're a very good example of the point you're making, because I was also in grad school, and that was a couple of years ago. So what happened? I assume the field has changed a little bit since then, or
just a little.
But what about also, how do we open this up to doctors as well? So you're doing this for the people in the field of eating disorders. For doctors, are there continuing education units, or are there programs where they're supposed to take that they learn about eating disorders?
There's not a lot for doctors learning about eating disorders, unless you go to the IADEP Symposium, which they have a national event that's been canceled the past few years. But their next one is next March in Palm Springs, fingers crossed. And that would be a great way to learn. And you can also join our board. We're always looking for new board members, and they can get a discount to the symposium and really attend anything going on with an IADEP chapter, and just get a lot of support for learning more about eating disorders. And that's not just for doctors, it's for therapists, registered dietitians, really anyone.
Ballpark, what percentage of folks suffer from an eating disorder? Is there a figure anywhere?
Yeah, between 25 and 35 million.
Yeah.
And that's a full-blown eating disorder. And I don't think that's super accurate, because even when people die of their eating disorder, which a third of them do, they don't get counted as a statistic. They'll die of heart failure, or ruptured esophagus, or some other kind of organ failure, but it won't say due to anorexia nervosa or due to bulimia nervosa. So they're not even counted.
And you raised a really good point, because probably part of the problem also is that a lot of people don't acknowledge they have an eating disorder, or they're never treated for this, or they never see you, Alison, or any other counselor, and their lives could have been a lot different had they gotten into treatment at some point in time in their life.
Absolutely. Yeah. You nailed it. You're right.
Yeah. Let me ask you, Alison, two questions. So one, if folks want to get in touch with you to find out more information about some of the work you do with working with people with eating disorders, what's the best bet?
I am at Alison, ALISON, at bodybeautybravery.com. You can also send me a message through my website at www.bodybeautybravery.com.
Okay, that's the best way to reach you. Then you mentioned, if anybody's interested, and hopefully we'll be doing a show on it, but your nonprofit's going to be having a conference coming up in May, is
September 9th.
September 9th, I'm sorry.
We're having a health fair for professionals, yes.
Super. On what's the overall topic?
We are going to be talking about perimenopausal and menopausal women that have eating disorders from a medical and nutritional standpoint. And you can find out more about that at IADEP, IAEDP-WNC.com.
Okay. We're also, I assume they can find that at the website, or you'll have information on
My
that
website,
as
social
well.
media, IADEP WNC chapter, you got it. It's all
Okay.
there.
Anyway, thank you very much for being my guest this first half hour on the Blaine's World Show. And hopefully we'll be in touch, or I'll someday maybe even meet you in person. And
Absolutely.
and thanks for your help in advance for that show. We'll do a show on this conference coming up in later in the year. Alison,
Sounds great.
you be well. Good meeting you.
Thanks, you too.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Bye.
As Alison kind of works her way out of the studio, or if not, I'll just kick her out. There she goes. Okay, we'll welcome our second guest in just a second. And as she kind of works her way into the studio, hey Jess, let me mention that you're listening to the Blaine's World Show, heard here on WPVM, and I'd like to remind you that WPVM's mission is to foster community through a program that cultivates dialogue to inform and entertain. The station provides the medium for artists, businesses, community leaders, and nonprofits to share their voice on live radio and also on Facebook Live. Listeners are invited to help support WPVM's efforts by making a tax-deductible contribution. You can do so by going to the website wpvmfm.org and looking at the donate option on the upper right-hand side. My next guest is Jess McLean, and she's a co-executive director with Read to Succeed Asheville in Buncombe County. And welcome aboard, Jess. Okay, you can wave. I'm sorry, I beat you to it. You can wave to all your fans and friends in Facebook world. You already did. Okay, and this is Jess McLean, and Jess McLean is an Asheville native, actually born and raised in Nashville.
Yeah, well, raised in Asheville. I moved here in '88 when I was 2 years old. So
Okay. Oh, so
most of my life in Asheville.
Oh,
From
okay.
New Jersey, Blaine,
Oh,
actually.
is it where? New Jersey.
I was born in Perth Amboy.
Okay, I taught in South River, New Jersey for a while.
Lovely.
Who joined R2S as a volunteer reading tutor in 2019. After joining the staff as a communications marketing specialist, Jess became interim executive director in 2021 and then co-executive director with Jamie Stanley, who we're going to have on a later show. So if you're listening, Jamie, we're going to get you back, we promise. And Jess oversees fundraising, grant writing, staffing, communications, and marketing with Jamie's support. In addition to serving in leadership roles with the organization, they also serve students directly multiple times a week, teaching phonics and phonological awareness group lessons with 3rd and 4th graders at the Arthur R. Eddington Center, and they also do some tutoring. And let me ask you before we go any further. So you were born in New Jersey, raised in Asheville. Did you always know you wanted to be in this field as a kid, little girl growing up? What did you want to become?
Oh, that's a good question. Thinking back on that, it's hard to remember. I do know that I always loved reading, but I never thought that I would necessarily end up in the nonprofit world. I was raised by parents who were like activists, who did a lot of mission work, who we were going to protest with when we were like 10 years old. But I was in the tech world for the most time after college. And so I worked for multiple tech startups, and I just loved volunteering. And that's how I got involved with Read to Succeed in the first place, was signing up to be a tutor and working with a local elementary student. And then because of some of the skills and talents that I had from my career, I was able to lend those in a position with the organization and then grow into a leadership role with my co-ED.
By the way, you're giving folks, if they're listening, some great advice, and you and I were talking about this off the air, but what a great way, first of all, to not only find out about an organization, see if you like it, but without committing yourself, doing volunteer work. How long were you a volunteer with the organization?
Well, I still tutor to this day, so 3 years.
Okay, as a volunteer. But you started as a volunteer. How long before you became a full-timer with them?
Before I was on staff was about a year.
Okay, but isn't that great? Just you were doing other stuff, and if you want to try something, volunteer for it or just check it out. You're not making a lifetime commitment, but did the volunteering experience, is that what made you decide this is what you want to do as a career?
Yeah, actually really learning more about literacy through this volunteer role. And I would say that to other folks as well, that volunteering isn't just a nice thing to do, and it's a great way to positively impact your community, but it is such a beautiful way to learn new things. A lot of people get stuck in their jobs and they're good at something and that's what they fill their days with. And when you volunteer as an adult, we don't get a whole lot of opportunities to go back to school for free. And volunteering is really like going back to school for free. And so when I joined Read to Succeed, I was able to learn a lot about literacy, in that the science of how children learn to read, what happens in their brain, because it turns out you can't just fall asleep on a book and magically your brain is able to read the alphabetic code, which is what we all write and read with. And so, yeah, learning about that really compelled me to get involved, because it's such an instrumental thing you can do for a child that will impact the rest of their life forever.
And to your credit, which I'm so impressed with, is the fact that you volunteered in a field that was not your normal everyday field. You know, you said you had done the tech stuff and you still could do the tech stuff, but to just try something different. What motivated you to do that?
Well, I was like, I never had my own little kids. I have a grown stepdaughter. And I don't particularly like love being around a lot of little kids, but I do like kids. And I was a camp counselor when I was in college. I babysat all the time when I was a teenager. And then coming out of here, I really loved working with older adults a lot as a volunteer when I lived in Texas and worked for a tech company. And so there's a lot of similarity between that. But kids are funny. They're funny as heck. Like I said, supporting a child and learning to read is one of the most meaningful things you can do for their life, because their life depends on it, on being able to read in this society. And so I was at the Volunteer Expo that the Junior League puts on every single year, and somebody was doing a booth and they're like, hey, want to work with a kid and teaching them how to read. So I learned a little bit more, and there was an opportunity, honestly, to go volunteer at the elementary school I went to, which is Estes in South Asheville. And so just that idea of like walking back in there and being able to be there as an adult, where I made so many beautiful memories as a kid, was also really, really enticing. So, yeah.
So talk about it. You came across Read to Succeed as a fair, and they said, come on board. Did they then teach you how to teach kids to read? Is that what happens?
Definitely. So you go through a substantive amount of training, because it is really important to do it right. There are lots of wrong ways that you can teach kids to read that don't really lend themselves to future success. And our training has certainly evolved over the past several years as well. But now our volunteers who come on board complete more than 6 hours of foundational reading training, which is super helpful. They do a lot of practice with reading specialists so that they are not only well equipped, but confident and comfortable when they go into a school and they work with one student or multiple students multiple times a week. So yeah, there's lots of resources and support, but definitely a good amount of training to get you ready.
Now, Read to Succeed is directed then primarily at children, is that correct?
Yeah, it's mostly youth services. And we also, so it's elementary age that we focus on, but we expanded our scope of work, if you will. That's a good nonprofit term, Blaine, remember that. Our scope of work back in the day, about at the end of 2020, to also serve pre-K children, because we know that 85% of brain development is actually done by the time a kid is 5. So there's a real window of opportunity there to strengthen a lot of these foundational skills like sensitivity to speech sounds and so forth, which will lend themselves to that child succeeding when they get to kindergarten and they're being taught how to learn how to read.
Because you raise a good point, too, that if a child is not getting instruction or bad instruction or didn't get any instruction at all, they're going to be behind the 8 ball the rest of their life. I mean,
you're right.
And some people, let me ask you that, it's not necessarily the thrust of what you do, but I guess it's very rewarding when you find somebody who's behind everybody else to bring them up to a normal reading level or speed.
Yeah, I mean, that's the goal. There's research, right? And there's this thing called the Matthew effect. Have you ever heard of that?
No, go ahead.
It's basically if you have 2 kids here at the start of a graph, right? And they're both reading at this level, and this student down here is now reading, struggling a little bit to read, maybe not as much opportunity is being afforded to them. And this kid's reading, not only are they doing better, but they start reading more books, and reading more books allows yourself to also gain vocabulary and more comprehension skills. And so that student starts going like this, and this student down here goes like this. And you have this gap that just gets wider and wider. And you're right, students that start out behind are more likely to stay behind than students who are ready to go when they get to kindergarten and have all the opportunity and resources made available to them and the highest quality instruction. And so it is really beautiful to work with a child, and I've worked with several students this year, and see those gains, even if they're minute, those gains in very specific foundational skills. So being able to tap out at and blend it into cat. We have students who might not have known that C made a sound at the beginning of the year, and now they see cat and they say cat. And it seems tiny, but that's huge. Children are mapping out new neural networks in their brain when they learn to read. It's actually, scientists will say, it's the hardest thing a child will ever learn to do in school, and they have to do it first, right? To be able to learn anything else, you have to be able to read. So it's really meaningful to see those gains.
And so, what's the name of that effect?
It's called the Matthew effect.
Okay. So why do kids fall behind then? In other words, that if everybody starts at the same level, not being able to read, how come, as you just showed, there's this gap and it grows? What causes that?
That's a good question, because a lot of folks, and this is something that we cover in our training, they might say, well, their parents probably don't read to them enough.
Right.
And that's a myth.
Is it really? Why?
Yeah, 95% of all children have the cognitive ability to learn to read. You have about 5% who might have severe learning difficulties where just achieving that proficiency with reading might not be possible. But cognitively, every single brain you look at, 95% of those kids can learn to read. When we look at, like I said, the phonological processor in the brain, which is one of those really important processors, sometimes it's just not as efficient as others. And actually, data shows that for most students, learning to read is going to be pretty challenging. And that's okay. That's why we have a beautiful, systematic, multisensory way to teach kids how to read. But many kids are going to experience challenges. And the best metaphor I can give you is that as they're building this map in their brain, some kids are on country roads. It just takes a little longer to connect things, right? For neurons to fire and wire. And with the right support and the right instruction and high quality support and instruction and the right resources, they get off those country roads and they start getting on the interstate. And that's what teaching a child to read really is all about. And so we see inefficiency in the phonological processor. Sometimes, you might have students who genetically are more likely to be dyslexic because their parents were dyslexic. I think there's like an 8 times factor there. So you do have some learning difficulties that are passed on genetically, but those can also be supported in a really meaningful way with reading instruction that brings them up to speed. And then honestly, one thing that's what we call a context factor, right, is that reading for the longest time was this whole language approach to reading. And that was the whole, you sleep on a book and we just surround you with literature and you'll be fine. And that wasn't the case. And so now we have science and good instruction that teaches that phonics is super helpful, phonemic awareness. That's what our local schools here in Asheville City and Buncombe County, that's what they focus on. And they use curricula that mirrors decades and decades of interdisciplinary research that shows us how kids learn to read. And so, yeah, getting to that point is really helpful.
You mentioned, though, in terms of parents reading to children, not a good idea, or they should read. You said it didn't affect things.
Good question. I would say that's a lot of times we put the onus on parents, and because our mission as an organization is really equity focused, we're looking to help close the opportunity gap through literacy programming. When we talk about parents don't read enough to their kids and that's why they're not reading, that's oftentimes puts the onus on our Black and brown parents for the gap that we see in our local schools where literacy outcomes for Black students are far below those for white students. And that's not because their parents don't care about their education or they're not reading to them. That is definitely an opportunity gap factor. When it comes to reading with your kids, absolutely. Everybody do it. And for those kids that can get read to a lot and then boom, they just pick it up and they're good to go. What a blessing, really and truly. But even for those kids who need some additional support, like what our tutors provide, reading to them all the time is a good idea. They say 15 minutes a day for any child is going to add millions of words to their vocabulary. It's going to add lots of background knowledge for their own edification, but having good oral language, high vocabulary, lots of background knowledge helps a child because when they encounter a word they might not know by reading it, but they're able to sound it out and they've heard that word before, then, right, they're able to make more connections versus going to learn to read and not really having a whole lot of vocabulary or background knowledge yet. And so reading to kids helps with that a lot.
Talk about two things, Jess, though.
Mm-hmm.
In terms, aside from reading kids, how do you get kids to want to read themselves? You know,
Mm.
in other words, you know, it's great. You can have a tutor one-on-one, but then
Right.
when the child leaves, what's the factor to get them to want to read more?
I love it. And families are always asking this question because we know that kids in school a lot of times are like, I don't want to read anymore. And I hear that all the time, and that's okay. We also need to make sure that reading is an enjoyable thing for kids, that it's not necessarily forced upon them. And so one way to recognize that is that reading is all around us. If like making your child sit down with a book is not creating a positive experience with reading for them, then that might not be the thing to do all the time. Right? We can read recipes together when we cook. We can read license plate when we're on road trips and we're pointing stuff out and we see tractor trailers and billboards. We can emphasize the sounds of vegetables that we're picking up in the produce section when we're in the grocery store. Literacy is truly all around us. So one way is to embrace that, which is really good, to get your kid to make lists with you. Maybe you're making a grocery list or a packing list if you're going on vacation, to highlight really interesting vocabulary. Say you're in the airport and you teach them the word terminal, right? Oh, we see the word terminal. Terminal has multiple meanings, that kind of thing. So embracing reading all around us is a good place to start. When it comes to books, though, this is kind of a bona fide thing. Find a really great series, because if you get a kid hooked on one book in that series, they're much more likely to pick up another one and another one. And then they've kind of gotten introduced to a genre. And then, of course, there's going to be other series or other books in that genre. So a good place to start is, instead of like random book, especially as they get older into those, later elementary years, middle grades years, get some great chapter book series and get them hooked.
I'll test your memory, but I have a smile as you mentioning that. Remembering the Hardy Boys. That was before
Yeah, I
your
remember
time.
the Hardy Boys.
Did
Yeah.
you really? But same exact thing. I just got hooked on it, and there were like 26 books or something. I read them all.
Yeah.
Put you on the spot. Do you remember, as a kid, do you remember any series you read?
Well, yes, the Hardy Boys was around, and so were the Boxcar Kids back in the
Yeah.
day. And then, of course, Nancy Drew.
Joe,
But
yeah.
as a little kid, like, I loved Amelia Bedelia, and that we call that a series, but really it's like a character that shows up, and there's lots of books about her. But that brings up a really good point too, is that for a lot of the students that our organization looks to support and work in and with their communities, a lot of books for a very long time did not have characters that look like them.
Right.
We just had an author do a guest keynote speech in an event that we had, and then she met with students, and she's an Asheville native, a Black children's book author, and all of her books are these beautiful mini biographies that are very accessible to kids about little and well-known Black change makers in American history. And so and she talks about being able to finally write books where she knows these will be on shelves, and kids at any moment can reach and find a book with a character that looks like them. There's a beautiful, forget the exact name of the professor, but she came up with the concept of windows, sliding glass doors, and mirrors. And the idea is that in children's literature especially, right, we need literature to be windows for students to travel through and to see things that they would not otherwise have seen. They need to be sliding glass doors so that they can actually open the door and step into a new experience and start developing their own identity around things that they get to read. But they also need to be mirrors, because when we see ourselves in stories, when we see ourselves in adventures, and we see ourselves in situations that we read about, and we're learning about ourselves and the world at the same time, there is nothing better than that for a child's education. And so a big thing that we do as an organization at Read to Succeed is, everywhere we go, we've got beautiful Black children's books with us. And these aren't books that are all about civil rights and slavery and endurance.
Right.
Right, because that is oftentimes like all we're going to learn about, less so now, but more so certainly when I was a kid and probably before that. And they're really more about culturally responsive stories where the community is featured, and there are communities that kids can relate to. They look like places they went to church or places where they grew up, and they have characters going on adventures like any other kid would, and they're really beautiful. And so our shelves are stocked with those, and we do a lot of book giveaways, free book fairs for some of our community partners, and then seasonal book bundles. We're all about it. So we teach kids to read, but also provide that culturally responsive literature.
what about having kids read comic books? In other words, and we'll talk about that because I remember as a kid that was taboo. I wasn't allowed to read comic books,
Yeah,
but I read anyway. But then it's become, I guess, more acceptable. They have now graphic
graphic
books,
novels.
graphic
Yes.
novels, and that's kind of more acceptable. What's your feeling about that?
I love it. Graphic novels are huge. And like we were saying, anything that kind of gets a kid interested in opening a book, go for it. Even if you're like, oh, this is way too easy for my kid, I want them to pick out a harder book. If that's the one they want, go for it. You can get that harder book and maybe read it to them so that you continue to enhance that oral language and vocabulary. But graphic novels are great because they are an alternative to that traditional book, which can be a little daunting, to be honest. They're much more action packed. And I mean, if you have any kids at all or grandkids, we've seen the success of things like Dogman, if you've seen the Dogman books. And those are huge and they're popular and they're really funny and kids remember them. And they also have done quite a few series around different graphic novels. There's a whole lunch lady graphic novel series I used to read with a second grader, which was just so funny. It was this lunch lady who was secretly a superhero. But man, oh man, that's the book that kid wanted to read. And that's what we did. There are still lots of words in there. We can always be working on sounds, going over vocabulary, asking comprehension questions. That can happen with everything from a poem to a graphic novel. So there's always an opportunity for a good kids book.
What's funny, as you're speaking, it reminds me how I got through high school French. And high school French, I remember it became one of my favorite books, movies, musicals, whatever, Les Miserables. But I got through it maybe before your time. They used to have something called classic comic books. And it was you got a whole story in like 32 pages with pictures, the whole novel. It was great. So I loved it. I don't know if they still are around.
That's
But
amazing.
but I
I'll
read
look it
it,
up.
but
Yeah.
it's funny, your point is so on target because even though I read the classic comic book, I eventually read the whole, it was a 500-page novel, and I read the whole thing, so it did motivate me. Let me put you on the spot,
Cool.
though. We don't necessarily have to mention any names, but there's now a whole thing, unfortunately, in many states about what you can have kids read, and you're talking, I mean, we will talk politics maybe a little bit here. It shouldn't be politics, but what a shame. You want
Yeah.
kids to read stuff that they can identify with. So can they read about blacks? But more importantly, can they read about homosexual characters? How does your organization even approach that, or do you at all talk about the stuff?
Yeah. Well, we say Black people, and that's totally fine to say.
Right,
And so we don't really, I mean, because our mission is truly equity focused and it's
right,
about supporting and serving primarily families who are most egregiously affected by the opportunity gap. So those are Black families in Asheville. And if you've ever done like a hood huggers tour or anything, you'll know that historic Black Asheville has been disproportionately
right.
affected by negative outcomes when it comes to everything from redlining to voting taxes and that kind of thing. So with that being our mission, it's just what we do. We share culturally responsive books. We actually haven't had to deal with anybody giving us a hard time about that. But honestly, we have some really great schools in our county and our city who are also embracing that, where other schools around the country are banning books. And we honestly know, right? Banning books isn't about the book. Banning books is about controlling education in the future populace. And so we understand it's like how they want folks to turn out is how they teach them now. And so we have schools like Claxton Elementary in Asheville, North Carolina, where they had their Stand Against Racism week up, their sign up in school yesterday. They are always having culturally responsive books on their shelves. They make beautiful recommendations. They might even have Black Lives Matter posters up in their bathroom, right? That's something that they stand for as a school. And so as an organization, I think we stand for that as well. But we haven't had to deal with anybody being like, oh, there's two dads in the book that you gave me.
Right. Well, it's funny you say that because as a kid, I remember, Jess, that was the big controversy where you could talk about divorce, that you never read,
Ooh,
a mom and dad, and they'd be
that's
divorced, and
right.
that was scandalous at the time, but it's
Mm-hmm.
a shame because that's society, and I guess it's just really scary to me that you would ban books or tell people what you can't read. It's rather than encourage them to read as much as they want on any topic,
Absolutely. And
but
some of the books they're banning are literally literally just beautiful children's books that are lovely and fun to read and interesting and engaging. And there's nothing truly bannable about them in the traditional sense. So it's interesting in that way. But I think it brings up a good point that, you know, the idea of knowledge by proximity. Right. When I'm closer and I get to know something a little bit more, it's obviously going to influence my opinion and my perspective on things in a more authentic way. And part of what our organization does is work within and in coalition building spaces with the communities that we want to serve. And so I fully recognize I am a white ED working for a nonprofit that is looking primarily to serve Black families. But we have tried very hard by adding Black expertise and professionals and incredible, passionate leaders to our staff, and then working directly with community organizations that already have awesome Black community members working there. By doing that together, and that collaboration and cooperation being the thing that really sustains our programming, those kinds of questions don't come up, which is nice because we're doing this all with intentionality and really together as a community. And I think honestly, coming out of COVID, Asheville's doing that more and more. We see a lot more community groups working in tandem, talking together, meeting together, saying, hey, let's quit overlapping with one another. Let's work together. You're doing an after school and you teach reading. Let's work together. Maybe we could have some tutors come to your after school, you know, that kind of thing. And that's been really beautiful. And I think the essence of what I believe is the opposite of people looking to ban books is people looking to work together and to do whatever they can to support children right now.
Jess, you mentioned just before tutors, and we also mentioned volunteers. Talk about how folks maybe listening to the show or watching on Facebook Live, how could they get involved if they want to? And then what are you looking for in terms of the community getting involved?
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Yes, volunteers can visit our website at r2sasheville.org. That's the letter R, the number 2, and S as in Sam, asheville.org. They can learn more about our work there, both our early childhood work as well as our K-3 tutoring and community stuff that we do. And they can fill out a volunteer application. They can learn more about how to support us or even just sign up for our mailing list, which is a good way to get alerted about family reading events, and news and updates from Read to Succeed, as well as volunteer opportunities. But the primary ways that community members pitch in with us is as a reading tutor. So you can train and serve during the school year. Our reading tutors, some of the best volunteers in the city. They work multiple hours a week, so it is a big commitment, but 1 to 2 times a week serving a student after training. But folks can also pitch in with our family reading events. We do these really cool reading carnivals, Blaine, where we go into communities or go right into an organization. We did one with the YWCA recently. We set up book-themed carnival games. We might have a food truck, DJ, a bounce house. We have tons of culturally responsive books for families to take. We also put together really thoughtful, intentional family reading kits, and they might have like comprehension guides in them, a book with an extension activity for the family to do at home, some more information for online resources, and Buncombe County Public Libraries oftentimes gives us stuff to put in the kits to let families know what they can do in and with the library system. So we get volunteers to pitch in with those events. Yes, staffing a carnival game might be one of those, but it's a lot of fun when a little 3-year-old's trying to like throw a rubber duck or something. And then we also have some office support help. So anybody who wants to pitch in, organizing books and doing stuff around the office with us is welcome.
How about this technique that schools used to do, and especially libraries in the summer, about reading, I guess, challenges or competitions, good or bad in terms of getting kids to read? You have to read so many books to get a prize, good or bad?
Right. That's a good question. I think it's good. I think a lot of our local schools still do that. I think that a little competition never hurts. We'd never want kids to be reading just because they want to win, right? We do want to inspire and develop a true love of reading for life. But also, I feel like when a competition is paired with access to books, it's a winner. If you put a competition together and you're just assuming that anybody can get online and read that ebook, or anybody can get to the library and get a book, or anybody can go to Barnes & Noble and buy a book, that's where we kind of fail our students. So I love when we can create programs and spaces, and that's what we try and do as an organization, that's paired with like intentional instruction and encouraging kids to read with all the resources and beautiful support that should come with that to ensure that that happens.
And what I like in that approach, what you just mentioned, is to make every kid a winner, not to have winners and losers.
Yes.
So
yes.
if you have 47 people win, God bless. The more the merrier.
Exactly.
Just we're up against a clock, so let me
Sure.
thank you for being my guest the second half hour on the
Thank
Blaine's
you.
World show. I'd also like to thank Alison Cross, my guest, on the first half hour. And Jamie Stanley, if you're listening, we're going to get you to come on board sometime in the future. And I'd like to thank Cappy Cassetti, my producer. I look forward to having you join me on Wednesday at 9 a.m. every Wednesday on WPVM 103.7 Asheville, North Carolina. You can also listen online at WPVMFM.org and watch us on WPVM's Facebook page. And it was great seeing you and meeting you, and hopefully we'll even get to see you in person. That'd be
Yeah,
great.
definitely, Blaine. Looking forward to it.
Okay, thanks an awful lot.